The morning sun filtered through the cracked window of the abandoned building where Lucia had spent another sleepless night. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten anything in 2 days except for the stale bread someone had thrown away near the bakery. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders and tried to remember when everything had started falling apart. Just 3 years ago, her life had been completely different. Back then, people would pay hundreds of dollars just to hear her play piano for 2 hours. She could still remember the feeling of walking onto those grand stages, the way the spotlight would warm her face, and how the audience would go completely quiet the moment her fingers touched the keys. The concert halls were always magnificent. Tall ceilings decorated with gold, crystal chandeliers that sparkled like stars, and rows upon rows of red velvet seats filled with people dressed in their finest clothes. Lucia would wear beautiful gowns that cost more than most people made in a month. Her long dark hair would be styled perfectly, and her hands would be soft and pampered, ready to create magic on the piano. She had been playing piano since she was 4 years old. Her mother, who cleaned houses for wealthy families, had saved every penny she could to pay for Lucia's lessons. Even when they could barely afford food, her mother would find a way to pay the piano teacher. "Music will be your ticket to a better life," she would say, watching Lucia practice on their old, out-of-tune piano that took up half their tiny living room. And her mother had been right. By the time Lucia was 16, she was winning competitions across the country. At 18, she received a full scholarship to study at the finest music school in Europe. At 22, she was performing with world-famous orchestras. At 25, she had her own recording contract and was selling albums around the world. The money came in faster than she could spend it. She bought a beautiful apartment overlooking the river, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a grand piano that cost more than most people's cars. She traveled the world, staying in 5-star hotels and eating at the best restaurants. She had everything she had ever dreamed of. Then she met David. David was a businessman who attended one of her concerts in Vienna. He was handsome, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in her music, not just her fame. They fell in love quickly, and within a year they were married. For the first time in her life, Lucia felt like she had someone who understood the pressure she faced, someone who could share in both her successes and her struggles. David encouraged her to take some time off from touring. "You've been working non-stop since you were a child," he would say, holding her hands that were always slightly sore from hours of practice. "Let's just enjoy being together for a while." So Lucia took a break from performing. She still played piano every day, but she stopped accepting concert bookings. She and David traveled together, just for pleasure instead of work. They talked about having children, maybe buying a house in the countryside where she could compose her own music, instead of always playing pieces written by others. But David had been hiding something terrible from her. The business he owned wasn't making money the way he had told her. In fact, he had been losing money for years, and he had been using Lucia's earnings to cover his debts. Worse than that, he had been gambling, thinking he could win back what he had lost. Instead, he lost even more. One morning, Lucia woke up to find David sitting at their kitchen table with papers spread everywhere and his head in his hands. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, and then he told her everything. They owed more money than Lucia had ever imagined possible. The apartment would have to be sold. Her beautiful piano would have to be sold. Even her jewelry and clothes would have to be sold. And still, it wouldn't be enough to pay back everyone they owed. Lucia felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. How could this be happening? How could the man she loved and trusted have destroyed everything they had built together? "We can fix this," she told David, even though her heart was breaking. "I'll start performing again. I'll work twice as hard. We'll find a way." But David couldn't handle what he had done. The shame was too much for him. 3 weeks later, while Lucia was meeting with lawyers trying to figure out how to save their life together, David had a heart attack. The stress and guilt had literally broken his heart. Lucia found herself alone in a hospital room, watching the machines that were keeping her husband alive. The doctors said there was nothing they could do. David died without ever waking up, without ever being able to say goodbye or tell her he was sorry one more time. After that, everything happened very quickly. The apartment was sold to pay debts, but it wasn't nearly enough. The piano that had been her voice, her way of expressing everything she felt, was loaded onto a truck and taken away. Her beautiful clothes, her jewelry, her books, her photos, everything that had made their apartment. A home was either sold or packed into boxes and put into storage that she couldn't afford to keep paying for. The people who had once called her their friend seemed to disappear. The phone stopped ringing with offers to perform. Word had gotten out about the financial problems, and concert halls didn't want to be associated with scandal. Her agent stopped returning her calls. Her record company quietly dropped her contract. Within 6 months, Lucia went from being a celebrated musician to having nothing at all. She tried to start over, but it was harder than she had ever imagined. She couldn't afford to rent a place where she could practice piano properly. The few times she managed to audition for jobs playing in restaurants or hotels, her hands would shake because she was so out of practice. Without her own piano, without time to rehearse, she sounded nothing like the musician she used to be. Soon she couldn't afford any apartment at all. She moved from one friend's couch to another, until she had worn out everyone's patience and generosity. The last of her savings went to buying food and trying to keep her few remaining possessions safe. Now, as she sat in the cold morning light of another homeless day, Lucia looked down at her hands. They were rough now, with broken nails and cuts from trying to find food in garbage cans. These hands that had once created beautiful music for thousands of people were now just trying to help her survive one more day. She stood up slowly, every muscle in her body aching from sleeping on the hard floor. Somewhere in this city, there had to be a way to use the one skill she still had. She just had to find the courage to try. The smell hit Lucia before she even reached the cafe door. Fresh bread, rich coffee, and something sweet that made her empty stomach clench with hunger. She had been walking the streets for hours, looking for any opportunity to earn even a few coins, but no one wanted to hire someone who looked like she did. Her reflection in the cafe window shocked her. Her dark hair, once styled perfectly for concerts, now hung in tangled strands around her face. Her coat, the only one she owned, had stains and tears from weeks of sleeping rough. Her shoes, which had once been expensive leather, were now held together with tape she had found in a dumpster. But it wasn't her appearance that made her stop walking. It was the sound coming from inside the cafe. Through the thick glass, she could hear the gentle melody of a piano. Someone was playing, though not very well. The notes were simple, probably just background music for the customers who were eating their breakfast and drinking their coffee. But to Lucia, it was the most beautiful sound she had heard in months. She pressed her face closer to the window, trying to see where the music was coming from. There in the corner of the cafe sat an old upright piano. Its wood was dark with age, and she could see scratches and water stains on its surface, but it was still a piano. A real piano with real keys that could make real music. The person playing was a young server, probably taking a break between serving customers. He was playing a simple tune, something that sounded like it came from a children's music book. His fingers moved slowly, carefully, like someone who had only recently learned to play. Lucia watched the scene inside the cafe with tears in her eyes. Families sat around small tables, sharing breakfast and laughing together. Business people read newspapers while sipping coffee. An elderly couple shared a piece of cake, smiling at each other like they had been in love for 50 years. Everyone inside looked warm and fed and happy. Everyone inside belonged somewhere. She stood outside in the cold for almost an hour, just watching and listening to the amateur piano playing. Part of her wanted to walk away, to find somewhere else to try to survive another day. But the hunger was getting worse, and she hadn't found any other opportunities. Finally, she gathered all her courage and pushed open the cafe door. The warmth hit her immediately, along with the incredible smells of food and coffee. The little bell above the door chimed, and several customers looked up to see who was coming in. Their expressions changed quickly when they saw her. Some looked away uncomfortably. Others stared openly, clearly wondering what someone like her was doing in their nice cafe. Lucia tried to ignore the stares and walked toward the counter, where a middle-aged man was arranging pastries in a glass display case. His hair was gray and thinning, and he wore a white apron that was spotted with flour and coffee stains. He looked like someone who had been running this cafe for many years. "Excuse me," Lucia said quietly, her voice barely loud enough to be heard over the conversations around them. The man looked up from his pastries and frowned when he saw her. His eyes moved from her tangled hair to her torn coat to her broken shoes. "We don't give out free food here," he said quickly, as if he had dealt with this situation many times before. No, sir, that's not. Lucia started, then stopped. She realized that asking to work for food wasn't really that different from asking for free food. Both made her seem like someone who didn't belong here. Around them, the cafe continued to buzz with activity. The coffee machine hissed as someone made espresso. Customers chatted about their plans for the day. The young server had returned to the piano and was playing another simple song. "I can play piano," Lucia said, the words coming out in a rush before she lost her nerve completely. "I can play much better than—" She gestured toward the corner where the young man was struggling through a melody. The cafe owner raised his eyebrows and looked over at his employee, then back at Lucia. "You want to play piano?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been amusement. "Yes, sir. I can play really well. Beautiful music. Music that your customers would enjoy." Lucia's voice was getting stronger now, fueled by desperation and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, this could work. "And what do you want in return for this?" "Beautiful music?" the owner asked, and now she was sure he was trying not to smile. This was the hardest part. Lucia took a deep breath and looked straight into his eyes. "Just a meal, sir. Maybe some bread and coffee. I haven't eaten in 2 days, and I can play piano better than anyone you've ever heard." The words hung in the air between them for a moment. Then the owner did something that made Lucia's heart sink. He laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the laugh of someone who had just heard something ridiculous, something that couldn't possibly be true. And once he started laughing, other customers began to notice. "Did you hear that?" the owner said to a woman sitting at a nearby table. "She says she can play piano better than anyone I've ever heard." The woman looked at Lucia with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Oh my," she said, and she was trying not to smile too. Soon other customers were listening to the conversation. The young server stopped playing piano and came over to see what was happening. People began whispering to each other, pointing in Lucia's direction. "You think you can play better than my nephew here?" the owner asked, gesturing toward the young server. "He's been taking lessons for 6 months." More laughter rippled through the cafe. Lucia felt her face burning with embarrassment, but she forced herself to stand straight and keep looking at the owner. "Yes, sir," she said firmly. "I can play much better than that." "This old thing?" The owner walked over to the piano and tapped its wooden surface. "It's barely in tune anymore. Half the keys stick. We just keep it here for atmosphere." He walked back to Lucia and studied her face. "You really think you can make music on that broken old piano?" "I know I can," Lucia said. And despite everything, despite the laughter and the stares and the embarrassment, she meant it completely. The owner was quiet for a moment, looking at the strange woman who had wandered into his cafe making impossible claims. Around them, the other customers waited to see what he would do. "Tell you what," he finally said, and his voice carried to every corner of the now quiet cafe. "If you can actually make that old piano sound good, I mean really good, not just noise, I'll give you a sandwich and coffee." He paused, and his next words made several customers chuckle. "But if you can't play any better than my nephew here, you have to leave and not come back." Lucia felt every eye in the cafe focused on her. This was it. This was her chance to prove that somewhere inside the homeless woman with torn clothes and broken shoes, the musician still existed. "Deal," she said, and walked toward the piano in the corner. Lucia walked across the cafe with every person watching her every step. The conversations had stopped completely. Even the coffee machine seemed quieter than before. Her torn shoes made soft scraping sounds on the tile floor, and she could hear someone whisper something to their friend, followed by nervous giggles. When she reached the old piano, she stopped for a moment and just looked at it. Up close, she could see all the imperfections the owner had mentioned. There were coffee ring stains on the top, scratches in the wood, and one of the keys was chipped. But despite all of that, it was still a piano. It still had the potential to make beautiful music. She pulled out the small bench and sat down carefully. The bench wobbled slightly and she had to adjust her position to find her balance. Behind her, she could hear the cafe owner talking to someone in a low voice, probably making jokes about what was going to happen next. Lucia placed her hands gently on the keyboard and pressed a few keys softly, just to test them. The owner was right. Some of the keys did stick and the piano wasn't perfectly in tune. But it wasn't as bad as she had expected. She had played much worse pianos during her early days when she was learning. "Any day now," someone called out from behind her, and several people laughed. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. In her mind, she could hear her first piano teacher, Mrs. Chen, who had told her years ago, "Music isn't about the instrument, Lucia. Music comes from your heart and flows through your hands. A true musician can make beautiful sounds on any piano." When she opened her eyes, she knew exactly what she was going to play. She began with just a single note, held long and clear. Then another note joined it, and another, building slowly into a melody that seemed to wrap around the entire cafe like a warm blanket. The piece she had chosen was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Not the most complicated thing she could play, but something that would showcase both her technical skill and her ability to make people feel something deep. At first, the cafe customers were still whispering and shifting in their seats. Someone coughed. A spoon clinked against a coffee cup. But as Lucia's fingers found their rhythm and the melody began to soar, something magical started to happen. The whispers stopped first. Then the movement stopped. One by one, every person in the cafe became completely still, completely focused on the music flowing from the old piano. Lucia's hands moved across the keys like they were dancing. Despite months without practice, despite the broken piano, despite everything that had gone wrong in her life, the music poured out of her exactly the way it always had. Her fingers remembered every note, every subtle timing, every delicate touch that turned simple notes into pure emotion. The broken key that had worried her became part of the music, adding a slightly rough texture that made the beautiful parts even more beautiful by contrast. The piano that was out of tune created harmonies that were unexpected, but somehow perfect. It was like the instrument had been waiting for someone who could understand its imperfections and turn them into something wonderful. As the melody reached its most emotional moment, Lucia felt tears running down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because she was sad, though she had been sad for so long. She was crying because for the first time in months she felt like herself again. For the first time since David died and her world fell apart, she remembered who she really was underneath all the pain and loss and fear. Behind her, she could hear soft sounds that told her she wasn't the only one crying. Someone sniffled quietly. Someone else let out a long, shaky breath. But nobody moved, nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to break the spell that the music had cast over the entire cafe. The young server who had been playing piano when she first arrived was standing frozen by the coffee machine, his mouth slightly open, staring at Lucia's hands like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The cafe owner had stopped arranging his pastries and was leaning against the counter. His arms crossed, his expression completely changed from laughter to amazement. At a table near the window, an elderly woman was crying openly, her hands pressed to her heart. The business people had forgotten their newspapers. The young couple had stopped their conversation and were holding hands, listening with their eyes closed. Lucia played the final phrases of the Nocturne with all the skill and emotion she had developed over years of training and performance. Each note was perfect, not because the piano was perfect, but because she understood exactly how to make imperfect things beautiful. The last note hung in the air for a long moment before slowly fading into silence. For several seconds, nobody in the cafe moved or spoke. The silence was so complete that Lucia could hear her own heartbeat and the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Then someone started clapping. It was the elderly woman by the window, tears still streaming down her face. She was applauding slowly but with great intensity, like each clap meant something important. Within seconds, everyone else in the cafe had joined her. But this wasn't polite applause, the kind you hear when someone finishes a song at a restaurant and people clap because they think they should. This was the kind of applause that comes from deep inside when people have experienced something that changed them, even if just for a few minutes. Some people were standing now, still clapping. The cafe owner was shaking his head back and forth like he couldn't believe what had just happened. His nephew was staring at his own hands, probably wondering if he would ever be able to make sounds like that come from a piano. Lucia turned around on the wobbly bench to face the room full of people who were applauding her. 6 months ago, she had been used to standing ovations in concert halls, filled with thousands of people. But somehow this small group of cafe customers clapping in their everyday clothes meant more to her than all those grand performances combined. "My God," the cafe owner said, and his voice was barely loud enough to hear over the continued applause. "My God, who are you?" Before Lucia could answer, the elderly woman who had started the applause stood up from her table and began walking toward the piano. She was moving carefully like someone who was trying not to disturb something precious. When she reached Lucia, she looked directly into her eyes with an expression that was part wonder and part recognition. "I know you," she said softly, and her voice carried across the now quiet cafe. "I've seen you before. You're Lucia Marchetti." The name hung in the air like the last piano note had, and Lucia felt her heart stop beating for just a moment. Someone in the cafe knew who she used to be. The cafe fell completely silent when the elderly woman spoke Lucia's name. Every person in the room turned to look between the two women, the homeless girl at the piano and the well-dressed lady who seemed to know something important. Lucia felt her stomach drop. For months she had been invisible on the streets. Nobody recognized her. Nobody knew who she used to be. In some strange way, that anonymity had been protection. It had allowed her to survive without having to explain what had happened to her life. But now someone knew. Someone remembered. The woman was probably in her 70s with silver hair pulled back elegantly and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was wearing a beautiful wool coat and carrying a leather handbag that looked expensive. Everything about her suggested education, culture, refinement. The kind of person who would have attended classical music concerts. "Professor Novak?" Lucia whispered, suddenly recognizing the woman who stood before her. Professor Novak had been one of the most respected teachers at the European Music Conservatory. She had trained dozens of world-class pianists over her career. Lucia remembered her from the conservatory, though they had never worked together directly. Professor Novak taught only the most advanced students, and by the time Lucia was skilled enough for that level, she was already performing professionally. "Yes, dear," Professor Novak said gently. "I thought it was you, but I couldn't believe it. The last time I saw you perform was at the Vienna Opera House, maybe 4 years ago. You played Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23. It was absolutely magnificent." Lucia felt her cheeks burning with shame. She could imagine what she looked like to this elegant professor. Dirty, thin, desperate. The contrast between who she used to be and who she was now felt overwhelming. Things have been difficult," Lucia said quietly, not knowing how to explain the complete collapse of her life in front of all these strangers. Professor Novak's expression was filled with compassion, not judgment. "My dear girl, what happened to you? You simply disappeared from the music world. People wondered, but nobody knew where you had gone." The cafe owner was listening to every word, his mouth slightly open. "Wait," he said, looking back and forth between them. "You're saying she's actually famous? She's actually a real professional pianist." "Famous?" Professor Novak repeated, turning to look at him. "Sir, you've just heard one of the most gifted musicians of her generation. Lucia Marchetti has performed in the greatest concert halls in Europe. She's recorded albums, won international competitions. She's extraordinary." Other customers were pulling out their phones now, quietly searching for Lucia's name online. She could see them finding photos and videos from her performing days, comparing those images to the woman sitting at the piano now. "Oh my goodness," a young woman at a corner table said, showing her phone to her friend. "Look, this is her. This is really her." The whispers started again, but they were different now. Instead of judgment and dismissal, there was amazement and curiosity. People were asking each other how someone so talented could end up looking so desperate. Lucia wanted to run. She wanted to escape from all the attention and questions and go back to being invisible, but Professor Novak seemed to understand her discomfort and moved closer to the piano bench. "Dear, would you like to talk somewhere more private?" she asked softly. "I have so many questions, and I imagine this is all quite overwhelming for you." Before Lucia could answer, her phone started buzzing. She pulled out her cracked phone, wondering who could possibly be calling her. She recognized the number. It was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman whose house she cleaned once a week in exchange for a few dollars. "I'm sorry," Lucia said to Professor Novak. "I need to take this." But when she answered the phone, Mrs. Patterson's voice was excited in a way Lucia had never heard before. "Lucia, oh my dear, I just saw the most amazing thing on the internet. Someone posted a video from a cafe, and there's a woman playing piano who looks just like you. But it can't be you because this woman is absolutely incredible, and you never told me you could play piano like that." Lucia's heart sank. Someone had filmed her performance and posted it online already. Mrs. Patterson, Wait, is it you? Lucia, is that really you in the video? Because if it is, then why in heaven's name are you cleaning my house for $10 when you can make music like that? Around the cafe, Lucia could see that several people were now filming her with their phones. Some were taking pictures. Others seemed to be making their own videos. The story was spreading in real time, just like everything did these days. Professor Novak gently took the phone from Lucia's hand. "May I?" she asked, then spoke into it. "Hello, this is Professor Novak from the European Music Conservatory. Yes, that is indeed Lucia Marchetti you saw in the video. She is an exceptional musician who has fallen on difficult times. I wonder if I might ask you to give her some space right now while we sort things out." She handed the phone back to Lucia, who quickly hung up. But immediately it started ringing again, then again. "This is happening very quickly," Professor Novak observed. "The video must be spreading fast. In this age of social media, extraordinary things can reach thousands of people in minutes." The cafe owner was staring at his phone now, too. "There's already 50,000 views," he said in amazement. 50,000 people have watched her play piano in my cafe in the last 10 minutes. Some customers were starting to leave now, but they were talking excitedly as they walked out. Lucia could hear them making phone calls, telling friends and family about what they had just witnessed. "I need to get out of here," Lucia said, starting to stand up from the piano bench. But Professor Novak put a gentle hand on her arm. "Lucia, running away won't help. Trust me, I've seen this before. When something like this video happens, it's better to face it directly than to hide." "But I'm not ready," Lucia said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I'm not ready for people to see me like this. I'm not ready to explain what happened to my life." "You don't have to explain anything to anyone," Professor Novak said firmly. "But you do need to eat, and you do need a safe place to stay, and you do need to start thinking about your future." She paused and looked directly into Lucia's eyes. "And most importantly, you need to remember that the music you just played proves that you are still exactly who you always were. Your circumstances changed, but your talent didn't. Your gift didn't disappear just because your life got difficult." The cafe owner approached them hesitantly. "Look, I don't pretend to understand what's happening here, but I know what I heard. And I know I promised you a sandwich if you could play well." He paused. "How about instead of just a sandwich, you let me buy you a proper meal? And maybe we can talk about you playing here regularly? I have a feeling that after this video, I'm going to have a lot more customers who want to hear you play." Lucia looked around the cafe at all the faces watching her with curiosity, respect, and kindness. Her phone was still buzzing with calls and notifications. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were watching her play piano and wondering about her story. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, the worst part of her life was finally over. 3 months later, Lucia stood in the wings of the Prague Symphony Hall, listening to the murmur of 2,000 people taking their seats. Her hands were shaking, but not from hunger this time. Tonight, she was nervous for all the right reasons. The video from the cafe had changed everything, just as Professor Novak had predicted. Within hours of being posted, it had been viewed by millions of people around the world. News stations picked up the story. Music blogs wrote articles about the mysterious pianist who had disappeared and reappeared in such dramatic fashion. But it wasn't the fame that had saved her. It was the kindness of people who understood that everyone deserves a second chance. Professor Novak had been the first to help. That very afternoon at the cafe, she had insisted on taking Lucia home with her. She had a spare bedroom in her apartment near the conservatory, and she wouldn't take no for an answer. "You can stay as long as you need," Professor Novak had said. "But in return, I want you to start practicing again. Real practicing, not just playing when you feel like it. You have a gift, and gifts are meant to be shared." The first week had been the hardest. Lucia's fingers were stiff from months without proper practice. Her stamina was low, and she could only play for short periods before her hands cramped up. But slowly, day by day, the music came back to her. Professor Novak had connections throughout the music world, and she wasn't shy about using them. She arranged for Lucia to audition with several orchestras, not as the famous pianist she used to be, but as someone starting over. Most of the conductors had seen the cafe video and were curious to hear her play in a more formal setting. The first audition was terrifying. Lucia sat at a beautiful grand piano in an empty concert hall with just 3 people listening: the conductor, the concert master, and the orchestra manager. She played the same Chopin nocturne that had made her famous at the cafe, but also more challenging pieces that showed the full range of her abilities. When she finished, the conductor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made her cry. "Welcome back, Lucia. We've missed having you in the music world." But it was Carlos, the cafe owner, who had given her the most meaningful opportunity of all. True to his word, he had offered her a job playing at the cafe every evening. The pay wasn't much, but it came with meals and the chance to practice on the old upright piano whenever she wanted. More importantly, it gave her a way to connect with regular people again. Not just the wealthy audience members who attended classical concerts. Every night, she would play for families having dinner, students studying for exams, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, and business people unwinding after work. She played classical music, but also movie themes, popular songs, and requests from customers who hummed melodies they wanted to hear. The cafe became famous because of her, but Carlos never raised his prices or tried to exploit her popularity. He just put up a small sign by the piano that said "Evening Music by Lucia," and let word of mouth bring in the customers. Sometimes people would recognize her from the viral video and want to take pictures or ask for autographs, but mostly they just wanted to enjoy beautiful music while they ate their dinner. It reminded Lucia why she had started playing piano in the first place, not for fame or money, but because music made people happy. Tonight's concert was different, though. This was her official comeback performance, organized by the Prague Symphony Orchestra as a benefit for homeless musicians. All the proceeds would go to help other artists who had fallen on hard times just as she had. The program was called Songs of Resilience, and Lucia had chosen every piece carefully. She would play some of the same classical works that had made her famous years ago, but she was also premiering a new piece she had composed herself, a musical story about losing everything and finding it again. As she waited backstage, she could see Carlos and his nephew in the third row, both wearing suits that looked like they had been borrowed for the occasion. Mrs. Patterson was there too, along with several other people who had helped her during her darkest days. Professor Novak sat in the front row, beaming with pride, but the person she was most excited to see was in the balcony section. A young homeless man named Peter, who had been coming to the cafe every evening for the past month. He couldn't afford to buy food, but Carlos had started letting him sit in the corner and listen to Lucia play, in exchange for helping wash dishes. Tonight, Peter was wearing a clean shirt that Lucia had bought for him, and he was holding a program with his name listed as a special guest. After Lucia's performance, he was going to play one song on the old cafe piano, which had been brought to the Symphony Hall just for this concert. 5 minutes. "Miss Marchetti," the stage manager whispered. Lucia took a deep breath and looked at her hands. They were clean now, with short, neat nails and a small bandage on one finger from where she had cut herself chopping vegetables at the cafe the day before. These hands had created magic on concert stages, had lost everything, had dug through garbage looking for food, and had found music again in the most unlikely place. She walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The spotlight was warm on her face, just like she remembered from her old performing days. But something was different now. Looking out at the audience, she didn't see wealthy patrons in expensive clothes. She saw Carlos crying in the third row. She saw Professor Novak nodding encouragingly. She saw Peter in the balcony, his eyes wide with wonder. She saw people who had learned, just as she had, that life could break you down completely and still give you another chance to be beautiful. Lucia sat at the magnificent grand piano and placed her hands on the keys. For just a moment, she thought about that desperate morning when she had stood outside the cafe, hungry and afraid and certain that her music was lost forever. Then she began to play. The first piece was the same Chopin nocturne that had started her comeback, but tonight it sounded different. It was more mature, more complex, filled with the wisdom that comes from losing everything and discovering what really matters. As the music filled the concert hall, Lucia smiled. She was home again, but it was a different kind of home than she had known before. It wasn't just about the grand pianos and elegant concert halls. It was about the connection between musician and audience, the way music could touch people's hearts and remind them that they weren't alone. After her final bow, As the audience gave her a standing ovation that seemed to last forever, Lucia thought about the question that had started it all. May I play for a piece of food? The answer, she realized now, was much bigger than anyone had imagined. Yes, she could play for food, but she could also play for hope, for healing, for second chances, and for the reminder that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken places.